Well, it's of course a thrill to be here in the site of the mill that Francis Cabot Lowell built starting in 1812. And very briefly, in 1812, he left Boston with his brother-in-law Patrick Tracy Jackson, and they came on their horseback to see the waterfall in Waltham, which is the closest waterfall of significance to the city of Boston, to the town of Boston. And they saw the waterfall. I thought it was 16 feet high. Some people say it was lower. And they calculated how many feet they needed to have, both to have enough water flowing down the waterfall and to build a dam on the other side of the waterfall as a supply of water in case of water shortage. So if you look at the waterfall now, there is this wonderful cascade of water, and beyond it is the lake, I guess, that is to some extent artificial, which is the reserve water supply in case there is a shortage of water, so they'll have a backdrop of water to flow down the river. So this is the site where they built this factory. And this is a picture of the factory around the time that is built by Francis Cabot Lowell with Patrick Tracy Jackson as the manager in place. And Patrick Tracy was about 10 years younger than Francis Cabot Lowell. Now, 4 or 5 years after the factory was built, Francis Cabot Lowell lost his wife. She died, Hannah Jackson, sister of Patrick Tracy Jackson, and he decided to make himself feel better by going on a trip to Niagara Falls. So he went with his brother-in-law Benjamin Gorham. The two of them went by stagecoach, must have taken days upon days. They got as far as Saratoga, and Francis Cabot Lowell became ill, began to cough, he had pneumonia, and decided to turn back. It was clear that he was near death. He insisted on stopping in Waltham, at this site, to see his mill one last time. He stayed here 3 days, and then decided he had to go back to Boston to see his physician, another Jackson, and he died in August 1817. And that was the close of his life. So I'm going to tell you the story of the life of Francis Cabot Lowell. When I first came up with the title of The Life and Times of Francis Cabot Lowell, some people said it was pompous, but I'm pleased I did it, and I'm proud of the title. So this is the mill. This is this very mill. Although the building we're now in is an extension that is built later. At later time. So the real mill is to the west of where we are. And this is the famous water wheel, I think here, that there was a sluiceway from the river that directed the water to the water wheel. The water wheel turned around, and all the machinery in the factory was run by the water wheel. So this was a water-powered mill. And if you think of the early days of Massachusetts, the great cities of Lawrence and Lowell were built on the Merrimack River, and the original industry of New England was river-based, water-based. And by about 1840, it changed over to steam power, so the big factories became inland rather than being on the waterways. But the original factories of Waltham and of Chelmsford and of Lawrence and Lowell were built on the rivers and needed power. The reason why Lowell occurred, the city of Lowell occurred, is because this little river wasn't powerful enough to sustain more than 2 or 3 factories, so they had to go to a bigger river to have enough water, enough power for their factories. Now, where did he get the idea from? Well, before he built the Boston Manufacturing Company, remember the Boston Manufacturing Company, these are Boston-based people. So they built it in Waltham, but their lives and their homes were in Boston. And the style was to have their factory away from town, to have a manager run the factory, but the principals lived in the city. So this is the idea. This is a factory in Scotland. And Francis Cabot Lowell, with his wife and his 4 children, from about 1810 to 1812, were touring Great Britain, Scotland, and England, and he saw these sorts of mills all over where he went. I read through his voluminous correspondences at the Mass Historical Society. There is not a single, that I could find, reference to mills. He's kept quiet about it. Either that or the mills, or the letters have been destroyed. But anyway, he kept his eyes open, and one of the mills he saw was this mill these mills in Lanark, Scotland, and you have the waterway, you have the factories on the river, and you have the homes of the workers nearby. So he sort of took the model. He did not steal the model. He wasn't a plagiarist, because he modified it and he changed things, he and Paul Moody, to fit the local conditions. Now this is the man. The only known illustration of Francis Cabot Lowell is this cutout. He was seemingly a fairly delicate young man with nice features, with a full head of hair. And this was taken when he was about age 23, 24, at the time of his marriage. And here we have his lovely wife, Hannah Jackson Lowell, the daughter of his father's best friend. And he was Francis Cabot Lowell was very attached to her three brothers, whose pictures I'll show you in a second. And this is the father, John Lowell, known as Judge John Lowell. He lived in Newburyport. He was a Harvard graduate. He became a judge. During the Revolutionary War, he had the choice of either remaining a loyalist or choosing the patriotic side. He very wisely chose the patriotic side. He remained in America. Many of his friends were loyalists who were expelled from the country, including the vassals. And John Lowell made his fortune, as from what I can see, of dealing with the property of the loyalists who had been expelled from Massachusetts, and his property then became the property of the state. So this is the picture comes from a museum in Amherst. And this is not Francis Cabot Lowell's mother, but his father's third wife. But she was like a mother to him, because the two earlier wives, Higginson and Cabot, died young. And this lady, Rebecca Lowell, Ting Lowell, I think Ting from Tingsboro, became the third wife of Francis Cabot Lowell and was very good to her stepchildren, including Francis Cabot Lowell. And this is her mother. They came from Charlestown, and they were a prominent family. Her husband was a judge. The picture was done, of course, by Copley. So there were people of substance, even in Boston of the 1760s. And this is Jonathan Jackson, the best friend of Judge John Lowell. The two of them went to Harvard together, became very close friends, and their children became very close friends. And in fact, the children of one married the children of the other. And Francis Cabot Lowell married his daughter. And he married Hannah Tracy Jackson, who was the daughter of Patrick Tracy Jackson of Newburyport, who was an Irishman who made his fortune in the shipping trade and dealing with products made in Massachusetts and sold in Great Britain and other parts of the world. So she married him and had 9 children in about 10 years, and she died young, exhausted from all the childbearing, no doubt. Now these are the Jackson family, the 3 famous brothers. The one was Charles Jackson. He was a Harvard classmate of Francis Cabot Lowell. The 2 of them were extremely close. When this guy set up practice in Newburyport, he had no business whatsoever, so he depended upon Francis Cabot Lowell to support him, which he willingly did for a number of years until he established his practice. The second brother was James Jackson, who went to Edinburgh to study medicine. He had almost no money, and Francis Cabot Lowell gave him or loaned him the money to study in Edinburgh to become a physician. He became a prominent Boston physician and physician to Francis Cabot Lowell and Francis Cabot Lowell's family. And the third brother, of course, is Patrick Tracy Jackson, who was the least educated of the Jackson boys and landed up becoming a sailor and traveling around the world selling cargo of goods made in New England. And when Francis Cabot Lowell decided to build his factory, he turned to his brother-in-law, and 12 years younger than himself, Patrick Tracy Jackson, to work in the factory. And the factory here was run by Patrick Tracy Jackson. Now, Francis Lowell had two half-brothers. The younger of the two half-brothers was Charles Lowell, who went to Edinburgh to become a minister, and came back to Boston and was the minister in the West Church on Cambridge Avenue in Boston near the Massachusetts General Hospital, and he was there for many years. He was a very righteous and I would say rather stiff man, interested in temperance, interested in all the good deeds, not smoking, not drinking, being virtuous and all stuff like that. And he had a famous son who was a distinguished poet. And the other brother, who I think is more interesting, was John Lowell Jr., not to be confused with Francis Cabot Lowell's son, John Lowell Jr. And oftentimes people confuse the two, but he was the oldest son of Judge John Lowell from his first wife, and he was involved in a very intricate trial in Dedham involving a young man who had allegedly stabbed his girlfriend to death. And the question was whether she stabbed herself in suicide or whether the young man had stabbed her and killed her. And John Lowell Jr. was the lawyer for the young fellow who was found guilty and hanged in Dedham around 1795 or thereabouts, after which John Lowell Jr. had a kind of a fit of depression and never practiced law again. He became a very wealthy man by virtue of the fact that his father had died and he inherited the property that his father had. So these were the brothers. This guy was very bright. He was known as the Boston Rebel. He was a Federalist. He opposed the Southerners. He opposed the rule of the Virginians, and he proposed that Massachusetts, as part of New England, break away from America and become an independent state, and even to realign itself to the British. So he was a fellow who had a brief law career, and then he devoted himself to agriculture and running his property in Roxbury. And he is the oldest brother of Francis Cabot Lowell. And all three of the boys went, of course, to Harvard, which was a tradition from the grandfather, John Lowell. The grandfather went to Harvard, John Lowell, the judge went to Harvard, the three boys went to Harvard, and many successive generations of Lowell have gone to Harvard since that time. But the school then was very small. There were like 27 students to a class. And when Francis Cabot Lowell went to Harvard, he lit a fire in Harvard Yard, whatever they called it then. He was expelled from the school. He was sent to see a tutor and spent about a half a year in sort of in the boonies and feeling very sorry for himself. And he was chastised by his father, chastised by his older brother. But he eventually came back to Harvard and graduated from there with a distinction in mathematics. Now, what happened after that? Well, you had three choices if you came from a good family in Boston. You could become a minister, you could become a trader, or you could become a lawyer. And he chose to become a merchant. And his father set him up in Boston along the Long Wharf, which is, if you can see it, this sort of extension into the harbor, where the tremendous trade of Boston was taking place with the rest of the world, selling timber, selling dried fish, and taking in molasses and developing a rum industry in New England, of which Francis Cabot Lowell took part and had his own rum factory and made quite a lot of money from rum. Now, Boston at that time was a kind of a peninsula. It was a little piece of land connected there to the mainland, and this is where Kenmore Square, I think, now is. And there was one road that crossed over to the mainland, and it would flood it when the high tide came, so you could go into the city, but otherwise you couldn't. This is very important during the Revolutionary War, because that's where the Patriots blocked off the English, and the British were were entrapped in Boston for a significant period of time before they decided to evacuate the city and go to Nova Scotia. So that's how Boston looked. Later they built the west side of it, which became known as the Back Bay, and the Back Bay was extended with land from Needham. That's why the Back Bay is quite large today, but it's land taken from Needham and brought by train to Boston around 1860. So this is what Boston looked like. Now, one of the great events of Francis Cabot Lowell, other than running his export-import business, was to build the India Wharf, which much of his trade was with India. And he was trading in Indian cloth, because at that time in India there were literally millions of weavers weaving cloth and sending the cloth throughout the world. Now, when the British developed their cloth industry, they undercut the Indians and let the Indians only grow the cotton, but not produce the cloth. So, but in the United States at that time, there was a tremendous inflow of goods from India, and Francis Cabot Lowell and his friends built the India Wharf, which existed until about 1860, and then was torn down. So what these were a succession of shops owned 3 or 4 stories high, with entrances here all over the show, and every merchant had his own entrance, and he had his goods on the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th floor, and would sell goods from the building. And the goods would be delivered on the other side of the street is where the wharf was, and the ships would come into Boston, offload their goods, and take them into the warehouses, and they were sold in the warehouses. There was also a street called Broad Street, which is fairly near here, where the retail shops were. So this is one of Francis Cabot Lowell's contributions, was to expand the trade between the Orient and between New England. And New England has become called in our time as sort of an independent city-state, because they had all their own commerce and their own ways of getting around the British and having commerce that was transmitted through Boston. And Francis Cabot Lowell was one of these people who did that. Here is another view of the India Wharf from the side. As you see, the water is here, and the ships would come in through Boston Harbor and dock at the wharf, and then offload their goods and be sold from the building. Now, there were other efforts to have a textile industry in New England, and the efforts were conducted by the Cabot brothers in Beverly. And they had, if you can imagine it, a horse going around in circles, sort of driving the machines, and the horse was walked around like 5,000 times a day until he dropped dead, or whatever happened to him. And that's how the power was. And it was a small-time event, nothing like what happened on this side, where they had the significant waterfall to generate the power. But these were things that preceded Francis Cabot Lowell. The other industries, of course, was a significant contribution of Eli Whitney, who found what was called the cotton gin, which was a way of extracting the cotton seeds from the cotton. And that way, before that was done by slaves, which took forever to get the seeds out. So having this cotton gin, which would rip out the seeds and make the cotton into long threads, expanded the cotton industry in the United States and also expanded slavery. So one of the consequences of having this machine was to increase the number of slaves needed to produce the cotton. And the cotton was sold mainly to England, but more and more was sold to New England, to the factories such as this one. This is where the cotton came from. It came from the south. And one of the first mills in this area, of course, was in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, run by the Brown family, the people who founded the Brown University. And the factory was run by Samuel Slater, who was a young Englishman who had come here and knew about how to produce cotton textiles from raw cotton, and brought the English ideas to America about 10 years before Francis Cabot Lowell. But he had a small operation. It looks pretty romantic. This is how it looks today. But it looks pretty romantic, but it was a small operation with a small waterfall, and he employed young children to do the heavy work, heaping
Slater. Now, how did the cotton industry get going? Well, for eons in England, and as I said before, in India, the work was done at home by people who were doing the spinning and the weaving, and they would have their table and they'd do the spinning and the weaving and sell the cloth on a piecemeal basis. When the factories came, and the first person to invent the machine was Richard Arkwright, who was, I think, a barber who had the idea of how to invent this machine. And this revolutionized the whole process of making cloth because it was done with water power. And he became an extremely wealthy man and opened factories all over England. The other one was Edmund Cartwright, who invented the power loom, which is a very elaborate thing. Apparently somebody said to him one day, wouldn't it be nice to have invented a power loom? And he said, hasn't that been done before? And said, no, it hasn't been done before. He says, well, I'll do it. And he spent 5 or 6 years or something like that perfecting it, and then he built the loom. Oh, this is when the Luddites came. And there were people who were very distressed by the mechanization of textile making, and people destroyed these machines, and it took for a while before these machines became part of the mechanism to make cotton textiles. And Francis Cabot Lowell visited England and Scotland starting 1810 to 1812 and got the idea that this is where the future lay. Now, it must have been a very insightful idea. And he was in Edinburgh for about 6 months, where he met a fellow Bostonian, Nathan Appleton, and the two of them discussed the possibility of building a factory in New England to make cotton textiles using raw cotton. And Appleton was so impressed by the idea that he said he'd go along with it. And he is the first person outside the Lowell and the Jackson family to give his money to build this factory. And then the need was to find a mechanic, somebody who knew machinery. Now, the Lowells were city people, and they were Harvard people. They knew nothing, I didn't think, about making things. So they needed somebody who had the technology of how to make the loom, how to make the machinery, how to get the machine to work. And Francis Cabot Lowell sent a letter to this fellow who lived then in Amesbury, and he decided to come, which was then a long way from Amesbury all the way to Waltham, to work in this site and to build the machinery, including the water wheel. So Moody Street, and there's a Moody Street in Lowell, there's a Moody Street in Waltham, named for this gentleman. So if you go eating on Moody Street, thank this guy for making it possible. And he was, I wouldn't say an educated guy, but he certainly was savvy and smart, but in a mechanized sort of way. And this becomes important, I think, with the Lowell Institute, because the one thing that John Lowell Jr. thought was the need to educate not the academic kinds of people, but the ordinary people who would run the machinery and run the factories. And the Lowell Institute lectures were designed to help the mechanical class people, the trade people, to run the industries. And he was one of the people who was educated by that system. Now, what is the Lowell system? I think essentially it's these ingredients. You need to have a well-financed plan. You need cheap power. You need the proper machinery. And you need something that a person can learn to do in a very short time. You need cheap, low materials, such as cotton coming from the south. You need capable management, like Patrick Tracy Jackson. And you need good workers. Now, Waltham in 1812 was a village of 1,000 people. It was a farming town. Unlike the English countryside that has had thousands and thousands of crofters and tradespeople who are making cloth, there was nothing like that in America. So they had to get the workers somewhere, and Francis Cabot Lowell thought of hiring young farm women, farm girls, aged about 18 to about 25, 30, who would come to Waltham to earn enough money to support their families, to support the farms, and to support their brothers who were going to college. So it's kind of a sacrifice. But the plan was that they would work for maybe 2 or 3 years, they would make their little pile of money, then go home and perhaps marry and lead their own lives. It wasn't servitude the way it certainly became as time went by. So this is the Lowell plan, and they had the young, not an end supply, but a sufficient supply of girls coming from Vermont, from New Hampshire, from the northern parts of Massachusetts to work in the factory. Now, where do you put them? Well, you put them in houses or boarding houses. So part of the system of the Lowell plan was to build boarding houses to house the workers who would remain 2 or 3 or 4 years. They wouldn't remain all their lives, and then when they had enough money or to get married, they would leave, and then their sisters, younger sisters, would come and work in the factory. And that's how the plan worked. As I said to you before, that Francis Cabot Lowell died a young man. He was about 37 when he died. He died of pneumonia. He was the man who had conceptualized the cotton textile industry, had built this factory, had hired the proper management to run it, had financed it mainly with his own money. In my opinion, he gave the other big shareholders, other than Appleton, were his brothers-in-law, Charles and Charles Jackson, and I think Francis Cabot Lowell loaned them the money to contribute to funding the factory. So he was the primary estate, his fortune on it. Now he died in 1870, as he was buried in Boston at the burial ground across the street from the corner of Tremont and Boylston, I think it is. And that was a burial ground that still exists to this day. And around 1893, they began to dig it up to build the underground, to build the subway, to go underground. At the time, they unearthed all these graves, one of which was Francis Cabot Lowell, and they were transposed and sent to Forest Hill Cemetery, where his remains exist to this day, together with his father and his wife and other Lowells. Well, let it go from there. So that's briefly the story. This is where he was buried. I took the picture myself, I think. It's still there, and these ancient gravestones are still there, so it's really worth a look to see who was buried there. But Francis Cabot Lowell, as I said, was initially buried there, but then reinterred and taken to Forest Hill. Now, he had 4 children. The oldest son, of course, was John Lowell Jr., who was named John Lowell Jr., which is the same name as his uncle, John Lowell Jr., and the names often are confused. And he went with his parents to Europe. He was there from age 11 to age 13. He studied in Edinburgh. He came back to Boston. He went to Harvard, stayed only 2 years, and then didn't like it much for whatever emotional reason. And then he went on the ships and sailed around the world to India on 2 occasions, and then set up as a merchant. He married a lovely young lady, Rebecca Margaret Amory Lowell. I think I got that right. Married her, had 2 wonderful children, and she died at age 24. Both children died within 6 or 8 months of each other, leaving this young man bereft. He chucked it all up and decided he was going to go around the world. Got as far as India, he got as far as Egypt, wrote a codicil to his will with the famous words that New England is barren, the land is barren, but the future of New England depends upon the intellect and the education of its people. Well, I think one of the most sort of astonishing sentences I've read in a long while. So he wrote this, he sent back to the United States many objects of Egyptian art, which exist to this day in the Museum of Fine Arts, all worth a look at. And he made his way to Egypt, from Egypt to India, where he died at age 36, and there was his best friend and brother-in-law took over the institute and ran it, and Lowell has run the institute ever since then. So this is the oldest son. And this was a memorial to him written after his death by Everett, right. So I've read this through. It's well worth reading. It's a tribute to John Lowell Jr., and it tells about what motivated him to found this institute. Now, what happened afterwards? So we have this building here, and what is the legacy of Francis Cabot Lowell? Well, the great legacy is that he established the Industrial Revolution in America, and that subsequent factories, whether they are textiles or heavy industry or steel or shoemaking, are fashioned on this very model that he had come up with. So in a sense, the American Industrial Revolution is based upon the prototype of Francis Cabot Lowell, built on this spot in 1813, 1812, 1813, and it became so successful that by 1823, 1824, they needed a bigger site. This was too small to run a vast textile industry, so they had to move it somewhere. So Patrick Tracy Jackson, together with Appleton and Paul Moody, went sightseeing to find a better site. And what better site than the Merrimack River, about 23 miles north of here. So they went there. Oh, we come back to this lady. Okay, hold that thought. So anyway, Francis Cabot Lowell had a sister who was 15 years of age. And she was a very pretty young lady. And suddenly the Lowells were being visited by a man called Gardner. He was Pickering Gardner. He came from Salem. And he'd come every weekend almost to see the Lowells. And John Lowell Sr., father thought maybe he's interested in one of the older girls, but he was interested in the 15-year-old girl. So he wrote to his future father-in-law, said, I'd like to marry her. And the father-in-law said, wow. He said, why don't you wait until she's 16? Well, they married, and they had a family, and they had successful children. And then one of the offsprings was John Lowell, who married this lady, Isabella Stewart. And she had lots of money and lots of ideas, and she built that remarkable building on the Fenway with all the artwork that we enjoy to this day. So that's one of the offspring of the Lowell family, a sister of Francis, a half-sister of Francis Cabot Lowell. And this, of course, is the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum courtyard. So coming back to the fact that this river is too small to sustain more than 3 or 4 factories, and they needed a sufficient water supply. So they went to the Merrimack River, and they looked at it, and then, as I read the history, Appleton said to Patrick Tracy Jackson, what should we call it? He said, let's call it Lowell. And they named the city, the future city, after Francis Cabot Lowell. There's Mentor, and they built a succession of factories that extended along the riverfront with a canal in the back of it where the water flowed from the Merrimack River and and gave the power to all these machines. So if you go to Lowell, to the city of Lowell to this day, you'll see this remarkable network of waterways that were partly natural and partly man-produced to supply this water supply to feed the machinery of these factories in Lowell. Well, within 10 years, of course, water power was exceeded by steam power, so the whole thing became defunct. And then after a while, the industry moved to the south, and the whole of Lowell became defunct. So what happened to Lowell? Well, here is a picture of Lowell, Massachusetts, as a steam power juggernaut. With all the Victorians loved steam. They loved smoke. If you look at pictures of industry, it's always smoke, you know. The thing we have today, but they seem to love it a lot. And these were the pictures of the great mills with the manufacturing cotton, manufacturing wool, manufacturing many other things, built on the waterways of Lowell. And after Lowell came Lawrence, Massachusetts, and half the cities around New England had water-powered mills based upon this model here. And then, as I said, after the Civil War, the South was in tough shape, and people from New England, I wouldn't say conspired, but decided to take the industry where labor was cheaper. And New Englanders, including these great mills, built factories in Alabama, and built mills in Alabama with machinery from New England, with know-how from New England, with architecture from New England, with plans from New England, and built a prototype in Alabama and in the South. And within 10 or 15 years, Lowell and Lawrence and all these textile factories in New England were being wiped away by the resurgence of southern textile industries, employing largely white labor. And so the factories became defunct. This is an example of the water power in Lowell. They had tremendous amount of water power. And of course in Lowell too, when at its boom, had the workers' cottages and one of the mills in the background. So the model that was here of having workers living on site and living in dormitories or in rooming houses or boarding houses and working right next door was copied from this design and carried throughout New England. And then, of course, the factories became defunct and were abandoned. And in Lowell, as in this building, the industry left and the buildings became decrepit. Now, one of the glories, I think, of the industry was not only using machinery, but making machinery. So in Waltham here and in Lowell and in Lawrence were machine shops that made the machinery to run the mills. And all these heavy machines bore the name the Lowell Machine Shop. They were very elaborate machines like these big clunkers around here. And they ran the machinery in the factories and produced the textiles with homemade machines, with homemade technology, and that became the pattern, and that gave rise to the boom of American industry. And here's another example of a Lowell machine shop, Lowell, Massachusetts, these elaborate machines that did all kinds of stuff to cotton. And then, of course, these iconic pictures of the mill workers. And by about, I would say, 1870, 1880, the jobs were no longer romantic. They were just tedious, hard work with young women mainly running these machines, and the machines making a tremendous din and sloughing off cotton fibers all the time, which got into their nostrils, they got into the hair, and it was pretty unhealthy. And so this is the machine shop, I think, in Lowell, and was duplicated in other factories throughout New England. And here's an example of one of the boot mill with thousands, hundreds of workers. These were huge industries. In fact, at one time, about 2/3 of the people who were working in Lowell were employed by the textile mills. And they made things like railroads. The first railroad, if I remember, is the Boston to Lowell Railroad, and we would carry coal up to Lowell and then bring the goods down to Boston to be sold throughout the world. And this is another part of my interest is what happened to these factories. Well, they had a labor problem. The workers went on strike, there were labor disputes, and they began to try to cut corners by hiring children. And this wasn't a phenomenon only of New England, it was all over America. They at one time were 2 or 3 million children employed in factories throughout America, both in the North and in the South. And these were mostly immigrant kids. And in these cases, I think mainly Irish kids who worked in Lowell and in Lawrence and in Fall River and all over the country. And these pictures were taken about 1890 by a photographer who was concerned about child labor, and these became very important in trying to stop child labor in America, which took another 20 or 30 years before it came to an end. Another picture of child labor. These are kids sometimes of 10, 12. And this is the picture of one of the mills in the South, I think. So how did the machines run? Well, they had these overhead pulleys, and every pulley was attached by leather belting to run the machine. And the whirl and the noise and the dust, it must have been absolutely awful. And these people worked 55 to 60 hours a week,
And it took a long time before they instituted the 8-hour day or the five-day week. But at that time, they were working 60 to 70 hours a week. Now, coming back to the city. So, Waltham began, as I said, as a small agricultural town. But when you have hundreds and hundreds of workers, then you need to feed them, you need to have entertainment for them. So the main street was built, and of course Moody Street was built. And these are the fine streets of Waltham to this day. And this is what Main Street looked like around 1910, when they had trolley cars running down the center. And these were, I think, electrified trolley cars. So it's getting to be modern times. And I bet you, if you go there now, you'll find some of these buildings are still there. And this, of course, is Main Street again, looking east. And I think you'll find the buildings there. And this is what this factory looked like around 1975. It was derelict. It was used for various reasons, but the factory had lost its purpose, and the building was fortunately restored to its modern look by some people who took an interest in it, including Marsha's husband. And it's great to think that this building, of course, has a life now. So in brief, this is the story as best I can make it about this extraordinary man and members of his family. They often married second cousins. It didn't seem to affect them in the least. And they went on to a lifetime of service to the community. And the fact that the Lowell Institute can exist after 170 years and still do its good work of giving free lectures, I think is extraordinary. Thank you.